One of the first things you're going to want to do if you're making a bag is add your stabiliser. So today I'm going to show you how I add my foam stabiliser to my fabric. I'm using a faux leather. Now usually I would steam press my fabric first to make sure it's nice and flat and to make sure that there's no creases and that it's pre-shrunk. But I'm using this textured faux leather, so I can't really do that today. So I'm just going to smooth it out as best I can with my hands. Now the foam I've cut slightly larger than my fabric. I've done mine quite a bit larger today actually because I was just using an offcut, so that's just how it worked out. Now if you're using a faux leather or something else that you can't pin, then you can either use some basting tape or some basting spray, or I'm going to use some pins, but I'm going to keep them in the seam allowance. So what I like to do is, first of all, hang on, which way? Yeah, I'm trying to think which way I'm going to sew it through the machine, make sure they're facing the right direction. So I'm going to pop one in that top corner there, and I've put it well within the seam allowance, so any holes are going to be hidden in my seam allowance, and I've put it with the head facing away from me, because then when I put it through the foot, in theory, if I've got it right, yeah, I should be able to pull that out just before I get to it. Okay, so now I'm going to smooth my fabric out away from me, and I'm smoothing in an opposite sort of diagonal direction, and I'm going to put another pin in this bottom corner here, just like that, within the seam allowance again. And then I'm just going to turn and I'll smooth in the opposite direction. So I'm going to do my 4 corners first, make sure that they're all nice and taut over the foam. Last thing you want is for your fabric to be saggy over your foam in your final construction. You don't want to stretch it too far because you don't want to pull it out of shape, but you do want to make sure that it's nice and taut and there's no wrinkles or puckers in there. Right, so I've done my 4 corners. You could leave it just as that. I'm gonna also add a pin right in the middle here, just to make sure that it doesn't move around while I'm sewing it. Now the seam allowance for the pattern that I'm going to be using is 3/8 of an inch or 1.2 centimeters. So I'm going to base this on at 1/4 of an inch or 6 mil. 1/4 of an inch, 6 mil? Yeah, that's right. That means that I'm just going to be inside the seam allowance of the pattern that I'm using, and I can trim any excess away. So we're not basting so far in that you'll see it after sewing your final seam allowance. We're just sewing a little bit inside your final seam allowance. So I tend to go around about 1/8 of an inch smaller than the original seam allowance, or 3 mil smaller than the original seam allowance. Now I'm going to change my stitch length up to number 6, which is the longest stitch length that my machine does. And I'm going to start, I don't know, somewhere on one of the long sides, and we're just going to sew to the corner, stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot and pivot, and sew all the way around all 4 of these sides just to attach this. So I'm going to start with my needle down, because that means that then when I get to the corner, my needle is already down. So as I'm approaching that corner, I'm just going to take this pin out and lift and pivot. Now don't worry if you go too close to the corner, you're not too accurate. As long as you're not going bigger than the seam allowance of the final pattern, then I think you'll be okay. Missed the pin there, there we go. So I'm just going around all 4 sides. and back to the start. Now you don't have to worry about back stitching, because if this stitching comes out, it's not the end of the world. It's literally just to hold the foam to your fabric during construction. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is you'll want some scissors, and I particularly like my micro serrated ones because I find that they grip onto the foam a little bit easier. So we're just going to turn this over, flip this over, and I'm pulling back the foam, and I'm going to trim away as much of the foam as I can, as close as I can get to the seam allowance. And again, it doesn't matter, it really doesn't matter if you go through a couple of the stitches. Don't panic. Just try and get as much of that foam out as you can. And this is just going to reduce the bulk in the seam allowance. So when you make your final bag, you won't have any funny lumps and bumps where the seams are, hopefully, because you won't have this extra bulk of your foam in your seam allowance. So all we do is just go all the way around, and I like to hold my scissors, as you can see, I like to hold them almost flat because I'm able to pull the foam back and snip along then and get a really nice close snip. So let me trim that thread. If I don't trim that thread, it will appear somewhere later in my final construction, I'm sure. Okay, so as you can see, I've got it just about caught in my seam allowance, but the majority of the bulk has been removed. So the foam is being held onto my fabric, or my faux leather, quite nice. There's no wrinkles, there's no puckers. That can be treated as one piece now, but you've got that extra stability of the foam being attached. Now if you're making a pattern for the first time and you're not convinced on the stabilizers, or you think you might want a different finish to how you've seen the pattern turn out, then you can always make up little swatches, just maybe 4 inches by 4 inches, 10 centimeters square, and you can add the different stabilizers to them. You can add your foam, you can add your Decaville, you can add your Peltex, whatever kind of stabilizers or interfacings you want. You can just make up a few little swatches, and then it will give you a real feel for how that is going to react once it's made into the bag of the pattern that you want to follow. You can see how it reacts when you fold it, when you bend it. Is it going to stand up okay? So that's how I like to add my stabilizer, and also how I test my swatches. So if I want to decide to use a different stabilizer, or I want to think, you know, say maybe, I don't know, I think the foam is not quite firm enough, I would maybe do a few swatches with different things with the foam as well. So I might add a bit of Decaville on the back of the foam, or attach to the foam before I attach the foam to the fabric, or a bit Decaville on the fabric, and I'll just do a few, maybe 3 or 4 swatches, just to see the different options and decide which one I prefer. So that's how I add my foam, and how I also modify my stabilizers as well. So I hope you've learned something today, and I hope you're able to use this in your next bag.